Warm greetings. Welcome to Wednesdays for Water. We are a citizens collective aiming to walk and talk water. We try to meet every week and connect people with various water worries and wisdoms. And in the process, we wish to curate future water warriors. The way we talk about trivial things for hours, water too needs walking and talking to address the rising water distresses. The way Wednesdays for Water is conceptualized as a prime time show, it wishes to make water everybody's business. The idea of the series was conceptualized in August 2020, and by the end of the year, the team and the structure was pretty much in shape. We started in April 2021 with Dr. Rajendra Singh Ji's inaugural speech. We wish to bring science and society together, and therefore we try to bring in every session either a policymaker or practitioner and a researcher or academician. We also think that future generation is crucial and therefore they have presence in each session. We are going stronger with every week now with session on either quiz, couple of weeks of hard talks and a week of soft session of art and music. There is a simple structure for each session of quiz, hard session and soft session which are moderated by the core team member. Here is a glimpse of what we call as hard sessions and soft sessions. Besides walking and talking water, worries and wisdoms collectively, we see this as a platform to cross-connect and expand our network and explore possible collaborations. We are also making notes to publish both scientific and non-scientific work. Here is a glimpse of some of our writings. You may reach us through email, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and also look at our website www.w4w.in. We look forward to your suggestions and comments to make the series more meaningful and engaging. And meanwhile, we hope that you appreciate today's session.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to one more session of Wednesdays for Water. We are very excited to inform you that we are inching towards end of 7 months of Wednesdays for Water. And today is our soft session. And we have Arijit Sen from Goa. And honestly, he does not need an introduction, but still as part of Wednesdays for Water, I would still like to do a very brief introduction and then probably let Arijit speak about his work and also his extensive engagement with the society. So he's basically a graphic artist, designer, activist, and the best part which I like about his work and the nuances in his work is the social documentation. He is closely observing what's going on in the society and brings out those nuances through his artwork, mainly comics. So he has studied in National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad, and I can also relate with it because now I interact with students there, so which makes it easier for me to understand his work. His first publication, which is our discussion today, as we are doing book reading today, is River of Stories from 1994. And he is also the first graphic novelist in India. And this was also the first graphic novel which was published in India. So it is celebrating the 25th year's anniversary. And I read that it is also going for reprinting, as I learned from websites. So the River of Stories book was basically Arijit's observation on the social, environmental, political dynamics which went around in the construction of the Narmada Dam and the whole social movement which was around it. So as I mentioned, what really inspired me to invite him on this platform was his understanding of society from various nuances. One of my favorite work, to be honest, is his A Place in Punjab. It's a very large mural experience which talks about life in Punjab, and it is displayed in Virasat-e-Khalsa. That's another monument there. A line from his work, I would like to open the floor to him, and I really think that we can learn how art can transform something from the society into in a more learning way. So what he says, and that is very inspiring for me, I saw that artists can transform something very painful into something very beautiful through music, literature, poetry, and visual art. And those of you who are attending Wednesdays for Water until now, you may have realized that we are really trying to bring out these soft sessions to talk about the water worries in a different way, where societies can communicate as well as connect in a better way than we do in the scientific way. So with these lines, there are a number of publications he has made in writings as well as in sketch form, in large murals and cartoons, and you can just name it, and also some fabric work. He has also established an interesting place called the People Tree, and something which one must go and visit, I guess, in Goa with Gurpreet Sidhu in 1990. And that, I guess, is still his main residence of work, from where he emits his knowledge and inspires all of us. With these few lines, I would like to really invite Arijit with a very naive question, which I always do. As a water student, when we use these kind of difficult mediums, I'm not showing your part of your book and beautiful sketches, because I leave that to you. And I'm sure people can also go through. I'm going to put all the links here. But a very naive question from me, who is hanging somewhere between science and society and really trying to do something on water. How do you use such an interesting medium to really convey a difficult subject, like as you mentioned in Narmada river stories, and really touch people's heart? Because graphic is one of the strongest medium to touch people.
Yes.
So I wish I was a graphic designer like your artist, but of course everybody don't have to do everything. But we would like to know, how do you really capture what's going on in every day? It's not Narmada alone. You are still doing everything. I read your work every now and then. You come up with something very interesting, and we can make out a lot of sense, and also, laugh out the various agonies we go through. So over to you, Arijit. And once again, thank you very much for taking out time. I know I have been after you for some months now. So we are really excited to learn from you. Over to you, Arijit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mansi. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you for that lovely introduction as well. I would like to take all of you who are assembled here today primarily through the work which you mentioned, the 1994 book, The River of Stories, because I think it would be of great interest to the people gathered under this particular platform umbrella about water. And essentially, it was, apart from the fact, as you mentioned it, people think of it as India's first graphic novel and other things. It was also my first graphic novel, or it's the first time I created something which was published and distributed. So as for any artist, that's a kind of a milestone that always means a lot at a personal level as well. So my main interest was to be able to, there are many reasons why I was inspired to create this book in 1994. I was around 30, 31. I started work on it when I was in my late 20s. And by the time I managed to finish and the book came out, I was in my early 30s. Before that, I had graduated, or I had studied at the National Institute of Design, and I had come out as a, working in the industry, trying to find opportunities to put my learnings into some sort of practice. And what was happening back then, this is interestingly just, I literally sort of entered into this professional life just before India's big structural adjustment and liberalization program. We were in the fag end of the 80s, we were feeling the rumblings of these changes to come, but we were still essentially like a socialist sort of a society. And we had imbibed perhaps those socialist ideals in a kind of a default mode. I mean, we thought that is what our country was and what we were hoping to do. And then through the 90s, we saw a lot of that being dismantled and a lot of the socialist ideals being, however, I'm not saying that the socialist system worked well or that it actually benefited a lot of people who really needed to, yet something was better than nothing. It worked at a certain level, and at least in principle, we as a nation, we tried to cling to some ideas of social justice, equality. However, with the 90s and the structural adjustments and the move towards liberalization, we began to realize that those ideals are being discarded one by one, they're being dismantled. And I guess I would say that that's a process which started in the early 90s and is still carrying on in more and more vicious forms. And hence, in some ways, as an artist, I felt compelled to address this changing society that I was a part of. However, as a professional, I would mostly get assignments from commercial entities because those are the people who obviously wanted to commission designers and artists to create work for commercial reasons. It was very difficult to think of addressing some of these larger questions which we were all faced with through our work. We were not required to. Nobody would come to us and say, create a work about social injustice. I mean, nobody had money to commission an artist to do that. People would come to us and say, make a good work to help me sell my refrigerator or whatever it is. So
you put it very rightly.
So there was this kind of sense that, I mean, at least some of us felt like we have to create our own opportunities to tell. We have to be the authors of our own stories. We simply can't be lending our expertise and skills which we have learned over 6 years of education to simply serve the interest of the of capitalism, which was, by the way, like I said, I mean, in the 90s, it was becoming more and more a nakedly capitalist agenda. And that was clear to us. And of course, we did work for companies in order to get our bread and butter and to be able to make a mark in our profession. We were just young professionals who had come out, and a lot of people didn't even, generally in India at that time, there was obviously, it goes without saying, there was no internet. There was not a lot of awareness. I mean, a lot of people didn't even know, for example, what is a designer going to do for me? I mean, why do I need a designer? You know, while there were companies who knew why they needed a designer, they needed a good way to advertise their product, or they needed a product that looked better than the competitor's product. So they knew what design could do for them. But for the public, did not know that. The public were unaware that design can make a difference to their lives or to their ideas or views or whatever. So anyway, so this was the kind of essential sort of a conflict that we, some of us, I mean, I'm not saying all people from NID were thinking about these things, but some of us were. And which is how my wife, Gurpreet, who was also my co-student at NID, how we got together and decided, okay, let's start a small space where we can at least, we will continue to do the necessary commercial projects that require us to, I mean, that we need to do in order to survive. But we'll also create a parallel small space where we are able to bring out things which concern us, which address those, and be the authors of our own stories, in the sense that we are telling stories on behalf of that larger humanity, which is not our clients, which are not, who are the ones who cannot pay us to tell stories, but whose stories are important to be told. So we said some of our time we will devote to doing that in whatever way, I mean, whatever small way we can. And so the River of Stories is a comic book that kind of came out of that effort to start moving a parallel way to do things alongside whatever commercial work we have to do. And this happened because I was part of the Narmada Bachao Andolan. We got involved because we had a small store called People Tree, which we started with, which was just like walking distance from Jantar Mantar, which was the designated protest spot for people coming to protest in Delhi. And so somehow or the other, people from these protest sites would on their just to take a break or walk around or see Delhi. Many of them from outside Delhi, they'd never been to Delhi before. And our place was in the edge of Connaught Place, which is a big shopping market, as everyone knows. So we were actually on that edge of Connaught Place, which is closest to the Jantar Mantar, and so people would pass by our place while they were heading towards Connaught Place, and they would spot us. And we had set up a small studio-like space where we used to paint and work and do our own things, and generally be open and invite people to come in. And if they wanted to talk or engage in conversation, we were always there. And we had some pamphlets and booklets from NGOs and people working on movements, social movements. No other bookstore would normally keep such kind of material. So we always created a space for that. So people would be curious, they'd come and look at the material, they would see us painting. Some of our paintings, we were painting on t-shirts to sell. We created, so we thought of these painted t-shirts as a kind of mobile posters that when you design a poster, let's say you design a poster about the Narmada or the development model which builds places like the Sardar Sarovar project. I mean, something that criticizes that government model. You made a poster, then you would have to make multiple copies of the poster, and you would take to different places and stick it on the wall here, there, wherever. While a t-shirt was like a mobile poster, because the person who bought it and wore it, then it was just moving in the street on its own, and it would go from one place to another. You don't have to take multiple copies and stick them, and it would go on its own. It would travel one day in Vasan Vihar, next day in Hoskas, third day somewhere else. So we thought of t-shirts really like mobile posters that people would, and not only that, so we were creating these with the idea that, but we wanted to make them very attractive. That was the whole thing. As designers or artists, we have to make it attractive that people want to buy it and to own it, and also to, in the process of wearing it, they own the message also. They put themselves into the message. They are saying, where it says stop big dams, then you are actually going around being part of that. So you also become a part of the, not just a mechanical way of spreading the message, but you become an advocate of that message. So this is how we started working with t-shirts and trying to kind of get it out into the public. And around that time, some activists from the Narmada Andolan came, and it became a meeting place for people. You know, whenever people were around, they'd drop in and say, okay, what are you guys doing? And it was like a adda place. And we were always working over there. So it was, we didn't mind. I mean, it was always nice to have people come. Even if they're not coming to buy, they just come and chat, it's okay. And then so through that process of getting to know people, we also, Gurpreet, my wife, and I, we both joined the Narmada Andolan in trying to support them and to do. So there was it no longer exists in Delhi, but it exists in Pune now, in an NGO called Kalpavriks, which was an environmental NGO which was working in Delhi at that time. And so they had a little bit of grants they would get from the government to produce material like, let's say, I mean, just environmental education material for young people, for distribution in schools and colleges and stuff. So, but not, I mean, safe stuff, like not things that start to question government policies, but stuff like, you know, a study of the trees of the rich forest, or birds of Delhi, or, I mean, nice stuff, but like safe, I mean, considered safe for consumption by everyone. So I went to the Narmada river valley with the activists. On a first trip, we went on marches and so on and so forth. There we saw, I was very moved by my experience, and I've been thinking that I want to make a graphic novel. I hadn't yet made one, but I had done many small comics, right? I mean, from my childhood, I've been obsessed with comics. We used to collect comics. I used to even draw, even in school as a child, I used to draw comics. So I wanted to make a graphic novel, a proper big story, which I'd never done before. And when I was in the Narmada Valley, I was so moved by the whole story there and meeting all the people there and seeing the landscapes and everything, that I decided okay, this is the right subject for me to make a graphic novel of. And that's really how I got started. And it meant it happened over 2-3 years. I went back and forth, back and forth. I did a lot of research. With all my work, I like to do a lot of research. I like to go deeply into the subject before I start creating something. And so the River of Stories happened over 3 years. And I was supported by Kalpabridge. And what was really interesting is because they were getting these small grants to do publications, finally, we talked amongst ourselves in a group in Kalpabridge, and they decided, okay, you know, your idea of graphic novel is very good. And they saw I was already making my own drawings with my own, you know, my own steam. And so, and I'd been back and forth 2-3 times. And so they said, this is a very interesting idea that you're trying to do. We've never seen something like this before. I mean, like comics which tell stories, which are serious stories, not for children. I mean, they are for children also, but they're not about jokes or humor or whatever. And it's about real life, and you're starting a real situation and making drawings and then depicting that in comics. So they said, we'll try to get that little bit of government funding we get every year to print, you know, 500 copies or 600 copies of your book. So then I was excited because now I also had the possibility of getting it published, so not just something I was doing on my own. So that's eventually how it came out in 1994 with a little bit of grant from the Kalpabridge. I mean, what I'm proud about today is that we therefore ended up using a government grant to make an anti-government book. I still feel proud of the fact that we managed to achieve that, because you know how the government departments are, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So they are just supposed to disburse the fund. They gave the fund. We had to give them a number of copies, you know, a fixed number of copies once we printed it. But nobody probably saw it. I mean, it probably went into the shelf, and so nobody raised an alarm saying that why is the government funding an anti-government book? But that's how it came to be.
I guess it's the comic nature of it, you know.
Yeah. So, okay. So then I would like to share with you the book itself. I mean, at least take you through some of the pages to see how the story works. I'll try and explain. We can't read the whole thing, it'll be too long. But I'll kind of skim through that, and then I'd be very happy to respond to questions, or if people want to see any of my recent work, if there's time, I can share some of that as well, especially the kind of satirical and political works that I create, mostly for I mean, I think of those works as a kind of an ongoing commentary about what's going on in the world around me. So those are that's a different kind of work, but I do use, I mean, for me, all my life, the interplay of text and image has been my medium. I mean, not only in comics, but in other forms as well. And how text and image plays is something that I'm always fascinated by. How when you place an image and a text together, it creates a different layer of meanings, and each one plays off the other to generate multiple meanings. So anyway, so without further talk, I'll take you through, I'll present the River of Stories to you.
Do you have the sharing option for him?
Well, it's allowing me to share. I'm showing me the screen. Let me see.
Yeah, because I also have the book ready just in case.
Okay, all right. Okay, can you see it now?
The screen is visible now, so please make it little wider screen. So yeah. Kalpabridge, New Delhi, 1994.
Okay, so is this good?
Yes.
I'll zoom out a little bit because you're not being able to see the full page. Anyway, so this is all right. So is this what you see? I mean, what do you see right now?
Yeah, we see the full screen, and also not the full full size, the vertical size we don't see full up to the Kalpabridge publication, but we see up to Amita Bhaviskar. And I read some beautiful work from Amita Bhaviskar, beautiful scientific papers from her.
Yes, yes.
I was quite fascinated to see how you people really work together into this work.
Yeah, we were both part of the Narmada Andolan and doing different work. I mean, she's an amazing sociologist, and she has herself done very interesting books on the Narmada Andolan, as also the Adivasi communities that live over there. And in fact, I have used, you'll see it now. I mean, I've used a narrative thread of the Guyana, which is like the creation myth of the Bilala people of Narmada Valley. The indigenous tribes of Narmada Valley are under this, usually categorized under this kind of a group of tribes who call themselves Bilalas. There are sub-tribes in that, and they are the ones who are most deeply affected by the flooding of the river and the creation of the Narmada Sarovar, the Sardar Sarovar, where a lot of people were displaced. So the Adivasi villages right on the banks of the river for many more, I don't even remember the figures now, but well over 100,000 families were displaced. So anyway, so Amita documented that a lot. She was a sociologist doing a PhD at that time. And we still are very good friends. And so Amita, I used to love her handwriting. She was like really neat and tidy, and her English writing was really neat. Her Hindi writing was really neat. So I said, Amita, will you write the text in the comic for me? And she very kindly agreed to it. It was quite a intense process, but she did that for me. And then, of course, I said, I'm going to give you credit on the title page because you've done a lot of work. And she was like, no, I don't want my name on the title page, but I anyway insisted, and that's how you see her here now. So Kalpavriksha is the group I was telling you about. They got the funds to publish this, so it was published under the name of Kalpavriksha. Okay, so I had to put this little disclaimer. Can you see that?
Yes, I hope it's visible.
Yeah. All right. So because, as I said, we got funds from the government. So so what I did was that the whole story is very clearly about the Narmada Andolan and everything, but it's fictionalized. And there's a thin layer of fiction which kind of gives us like, it's more like a fig leaf to say that, okay, look, this is not about Narmada movement. It's about a fictional river and a fictional place. And hence I had to put this little disclaimer before I right at the beginning of the story.
But that is also and the beauty of artwork, where we were talking about the most painful way can be brought in the most beautiful way, then people will not relate it directly.
Yeah, exactly. And also, when you report stuff about, about, let's say, that 100,000 people have been displaced in the newspapers and in most mainstream media, it'll just be a figure, 100,000.
Yes.
But each of those 100,000, what are their lives? I mean, each one, it consists of 100,000 lives, and each life is unique and different and special. That doesn't come through, right? Mm-hmm. So that was also my kind of impetus. I wanted to at least get people to understand this, that you don't have to just say, oh, it's okay because only 50,000 are being, out of 100,000, 30,000 are being rehabilitated. It's not just a matter of playing with numbers. It's like each of those numbers means a life, a human life. So I wanted to make people think about that. So anyway, so that's how the story works. I mean, it begins with a guy watching TV, and so this guy who's a protagonist in a way, his name is Vishnu. So he's a bit like me. I mean, as in he is a guy who goes into and I've called the river and in question over here the Reva. The Reva is actually the old name for Narmada, but in today's context, if I call it Reva, at least it's like making it fictional. There is no real river called Reva right now. So at the same time, anybody who knows the history of the Narmada and who's from that region will know that this is the Narmada because it's the old name of the Narmada. Anyhow, so it begins with this guy. He's watching. He's just an urban kid. Also, my main concern here, I mean, like I said, it was before the time, or at least today with the internet and all of that, urban people, young people, if they are interested, they can find details or they can go deeply into subjects that are not directly connected to their urban lives, like what's going on with Maoists in Bastar, or what's going on with villagers in Kashmir, or they are able to connect and find out if they are interested. But back in the 90s, it was very difficult. There was only newspapers and magazines, and if the newspapers chose not to report on all these issues, the people didn't know what was happening. The people couldn't know. There was no way for them to know. And like I said, they would usually, if there was news about Narmada, it would be buried in the back page, a small article which said 1,000 people have been injured in police lathi charge or whatever. It means nothing. It's just like a little factoid which doesn't move anyone. It makes no one think why are these people being attacked by the police. This is not, it's just, so it's very, so I want to create a way by which young people in the cities become aware of what's going on in the name of their own progress and development. I mean, after all, the electricity that the dam generates or whatever, these are all meant for the benefit of the cities. But there is somebody who's paying the cost for that, for that development. This, the young people don't know. So they are just living in the cities, being the beneficiaries, but then unaware that somebody else, somewhere else, a boy or a girl just like them of their age is suffering because they are having to pay the cost for what you are doing here. I mean, even if you're living a normal life, you're not an exploiter, you're just going to college, going to school, it's still coming at a cost to somebody else, and that needs to be recognized. So that was my sort of intention. Anyway, so therefore it begins with this young man who's like an urban young person who's watching TV. He's pissed off that India has lost in the cricket match, and he switches the channel, and suddenly he sees a Republic Day kind of parade being televised, and he feels irritated by the pompousness with which the whole thing is being conducted. I'm quite surprised when I look back at it. This is done in 1992. I mean, these are the same shit that's being talked about even now. I mean,
today, yeah.
Anti-national. I mean, wow. I mean, how come all this anti-national stuff we were talking about back in 1991 also? I mean, it's nothing new. That's what surprises me, that people still get so agitated that somebody says anti-national things. People have been saying this ever since the nation was formed. There have been anti-nationals. That's the whole point. Anyway, so here is the example. I mean, this young man, Vishnu, is quite skeptical about whatever the politicians are saying on Republic Day, and he makes some sarcastic remarks and stuff. Meanwhile, there's a little bit of humorous exercise happening outside the TV. We see the reality of India. They're two drunks talking to each other about. They can overhear what's going on the TV, and they are making jokes about it and stuff. And then suddenly the TV starts, the politician in the television starts talking back to him. I mean, to this young man Vishnu, and as you can say at the bottom, and there's a little toy stuffed teddy like a lot of middle class people would have on their televisions or whatever.
TV, yes.
So he also becomes animated once the politician starts talking. And when the politician sort of makes a mocking remark about, and this guy is totally surprised that this TV is talking back to me. You can see the stuffed there also. He's pointing at him and laughing. So the whole TV, the various things kind of become animated. And
he questions in the politician that, do you think I'm a socialist?
Yeah, that's what's happening there. Because the politician calls him a socialist. He says, because he makes a dismissive remark. And then the politician says, I heard that, young man. So this fellow gets totally surprised. And the politician says, we do not take kindly to such dismissive remarks being made about matters of national importance, especially when they're made by misguided socialists like you. So this guy surprises.
We have those situations, huh, Arijit?
Huh?
We still have those situations.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. When
chemistry is going to stay between people and the government.
Yeah. And that's what I look back at this. This was done almost 30 years ago. And yes, these things have not changed. I mean, we have not learned anything. We haven't progressed in terms of our thinking or our ability to deal with dissent. Nothing. I mean, we're still in this same boat of calling people anti-national, socialist. In fact, it's gotten worse. I mean, we've become much more abusive about matters like this. Anyway, so then, so we go and and since so the politician says, so Vishnu is surprised that he's being called a socialist because he hasn't thought of himself as a socialist. He's not yet politicized at a conscious level. He's just critical of the government, but he's not he doesn't think of himself as a socialist or a communist or whatever. So when he says, oh, what, me, a socialist? And so the politician carries on, says, Okay, anyway, a useless sociology graduate.
Sociology graduate. I mean, the guy is actually in the entire story is a naive citizen.
Yeah.
Who doesn't know which side he or she is, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, towards the end, he becomes very convinced that the Narmada Andolan is the, I mean, that's the kind of, has mounted the right critique of the mounted critique which he inherently felt earlier, but could not articulate or put into words. Once he encounters the Andolan, he begins to realize that, yes, this is what I want to say or wanted to say, but I didn't have the words or I didn't quite understand where my discomfort or criticism was coming from. So he realizes that this is the thing. And at some level, I would say loosely, that just mirrors my own path. You know, when I went and got involved with the Narmada Andolan, I didn't know too much. I mean, I knew something and I felt I needed to know. I was looking for some answers. I was always already critical of the whole commercial system. I was, like I said, I was doing job that I wanted to address something other than that. And and so in a very broad sense, this Vishnu's journey kind of sort of is a image, I mean, reflects my own process of learning in this whole thing. Anyhow, so all kind of things happen, and the politician is driving around in a car, and he's talking to him over his and he's got a phone now. This is in 93 or 92. There were no mobile phones then, but this guy's got a satellite phone. So, and he's talking about the fact that we are going to revolutionize architecture. We're going to be building the largest dams, the latest reactors. So all of this talk was already there. And these are the things that we are today seeing the
development.
Yeah. So anyway, so then the guy the politician just mocks him, tells him you're really off on the wrong path, and you are, you don't know what the future is like. You are kind of out of touch, and he suggests that you change your ways of thinking. Otherwise, you're going to be left far behind. And then he rushes to the airport, gets onto a helicopter, and flies off laughing. And then his mother, Vishnu's mother, wakes him up. So this whole thing is like a dream sequence. I mean, it ends with his mother waking him and saying, "Hey, wake up, wake up. You got to go for the first day of your job as a journalist." And so then we see, the reader sees that, oh, this was like a dream that Vishnu had. And then I have little kind of text pieces which connect different parts of the story to each other, the visual story. I won't go into reading it right now. And so then the first part of the story is called The Spring. And it shows an image of a small shrine, Adivasi shrine, where these continuously over the years, people come and offer, either during festive occasions or on individual pujas, they come and offer these terracotta horses. They're made from terracotta, beautifully sculpted little horses, which they come and they put on the shrine. And slowly over time, when you come across these in the middle of a forest, you just see like trees and grasses and everything, like an undisturbed forest. But this big pile of these broken terracotta horses. And it was a very beautiful sight. And to me, it was like something that really, when I first came across it, I was totally amazed by it. And so I drew this as a kind of so I structured the story like a river. Therefore, the part one is called The Spring. I mean, where the river originates from. And I related visually to the life and culture, religion and practice of the Adivasi people, which is the spring. To me, that is the spring from which other bigger and so-called more advanced civilizations have come. They all came from this original story of the Adivasi people and how they understood the world, and which they still practice in different ways. So this is like the chapter opening for this chapter, and it begins with the character called Malgu Gayan, who's like the shaman. I mean, I'm using a word English word shaman because for the lack of a, it's not really, I mean, it's actually like, I would say they're called bhagats or bhagat bhakt. I mean, in a sense, somebody who is a devotee of the forest spirits. So it's not used in the, I mean, it's not like for a Hindu god or goddess. It's like somebody who's affiliated with the forest spirits, who worships the forest spirits and is in charge, or rather sort of is in communication with them. I mean, this person receives the wisdom of the forest spirits and therefore is a kind of a mediator between the natural world and the human world. So they know this.
A very common word used in the central India, bhagat.
Yeah, it is used quite widely. And so then they, so the bhagat is called, in this case, he is also called a Gayan, which means the singer, like person who sings. But he is the Gayan, as in he has the right and the knowledge to sing the original creation song of the Binala people. And it's not done just anytime and anywhere, but it's done on particular occasions and when people gather, and there's a ceremonial thing about it. But he is the keeper of that knowledge. It's a totally oral tradition. So there are no books in which this is written. I mean, that the Gayan is maintained, kept alive by people like Malgu. In this case, his name.
Arijit, let me just see if he lost his connection. I can take it.
Valley, yes. And acknowledges their complete dependence on. Okay, I'm getting a sign saying my internet is unstable. Is it still visible?
There was just like 10 seconds, I will say, gap. So please continue. We are hearing you.
Okay. So it begins, the song itself begins by Malgu introducing himself. He says, I am Malgu Gayan. God give me wisdom. On my tongue, I have God's wisdom. On my lap, I have a rangai. A rangai is this instrument that he plays. I will sing to you the song of all existence. So listen well. Kujum Chantu, the universe, lay on her back. On her enormous fat belly lived the original humans.
What I will just add here, Arijit, when I was just going through, first I skimmed your text, and then when I was going through. So when Gayan actually starts talking, then Mother River is his first impression of the river. This woman.
Yes.
Kujum Chantu. Huh?
Yeah. I mean, there is some. We'll go into that later. There is something interesting here, which I have kind of connected with different tribal communities in India, because in a sense, I also wanted my readers to understand that although I'm using the Malgu Gayan as the character, the storyteller, this is a, let's say, worldview or a way of life which is not restricted to only the Bilala people. I mean, this is a way of life and worldview shared by many communities in different parts of India. And so I wanted to relate it to them. So I brought in elements from different creation myths to, at this point, the beginning part, to make like a kind of a little bit of montage. Anyway, so
belief is universal. So
yeah, exactly. So Kujum Chantu, the universe, lay on her back. On her enormous fat belly lived the original humans. One day it occurred to Kujum Chantu that if she ever got up and walked about, everyone would fall off and be killed. She decided to make a world for humans to live on. She rubbed some dirt off her chest and shaped it, kneaded it, squeezed it, and patted it. Made a world full of pits and holes, projections and distortions. Smooth in some places, rough in others, and held it in the palm of her hand, well pleased. I have made the world, but it's barren. How shall I give it life? So she made trees, shrubs, and grasses and planted them. Beautiful looks my world, but what shall be the creatures to inhabit it? She took some clay and started shaped some lizards, made some tigers and bears, made some snakes and birds. All kinds of creatures she shaped to put blood into all of them. She planted a garden. Part of this garden was for us humans. This was the garden of Jowar. Jowar is the primary millet that they cultivate and eat. She gave breasts to the jowar. That is why if we don't eat jowar, our blood dries up. For livestock, there was a garden of gingivi grass. She gave it breasts too. So the livestock also came to have blood. So this also very interesting connection here, saying that when you drink milk from the breast, that is what brings blood to you and gives you life. And for lizards, there was the brown colored Bengali pool. For snakes, the ninkal tree, and with its poisonous flowers of blue and yellow. So these are obviously all names of local, trees and shrubs and herbs and so on. Now, what I'm showing, what I'm doing here is also pretty edited and shortened. Obviously, the Gayan is something that is sung over the whole night. It's a really long thing, and it contains a lot of knowledge. I mean, it is actually how knowledge is passed on. So they would kind of in the telling of that, and all the community would gather at night to listen to the Gayan when it's being sung. All these different, so there is a botanical knowledge that is embedded into this song. People learn about which are the important herbs and grasses and all that, because there is no textbook. I mean, it's not like a literate or a culture, it's an oral culture. So all these stories were very long because they brought in all the essential knowledge also. So I've just used very, very edited version. In fact, Amita was studying this Gayan also, and Amita Bhaviskar, whose name you came across earlier, she is the one who translated this from the original Bilhala. Again, her version is also quite a bit longer, but not even her version is as long as the actual thing. But here I've taken an edited version from her version, so it's very cut down. It's like literally contains maybe 5% of the actual information that's there in the original Gayan. And so it ends with one part of the Gayan where it says how the world was created by Kuzum Chand. How it took shape and how she gave it form and how she gave life to it. And then we see in the an urban home in Delhi or in any city, could be Bhopal, Delhi, wherever, Hyderabad. And there is a lady sweeping the floor. And okay, now here is where, I mean, this is just one example. I mean, I'm trying to deal with non-textual cultures, and I want to be I want to honor those and be respectful to them, even though I'm working with text and image. So rather than try to convey some sound or something which she is singing while she's mopping the floor, I make a drawing. So there I feel that I'm using drawing as an ally of language. I mean, as in we are drawing and non-textual, I mean, speech are allied against the tyranny of the written word, which is, we all know, is also at one level. I've always felt that as an artist, I mean, this is also, just to give an example, I mean, when I was working on projects, if I was working with let's say an advertising agency, I was a illustrator for a project, and I was working with a copywriter. The copywriter would be given more importance, would earn more money than me as the artist or illustrator. I was seen as one rung lower than a person who deals with language and text. And I always felt that it's a kind of, so I also felt discriminated by textual knowledge. I also felt, even though I'm very familiar with it, I also felt that textual knowledge is something that imposes itself into all means of knowledge. And textual knowledge has made it such that knowledge which is not textual is not given a kind of credibility. It's given a lower credibility than knowledge which is text.
I can relate. That also applies to the sound as well.
Yes.
It is more impactful now considered than even text and graphics.
Yes, absolutely. So anyway, so I wanted to kind of, so throughout my book, I've used little devices by which I can communicate, let's say, give the non-textual speech, especially of the people who don't belong to textual traditions, a kind of feel of its own, either it's through an image or even where I want to write the actual meaning of the words because I want my readers to know what she's singing. I've kind of done it in such a way that it feels like a sort of a waves of a song. Anyway, so she's singing and we see that she's working inside an urban house. And then we see Vishnu, who is the protagonist. He comes into the room and he says, so she kind of is busy with her work and she says, can you sit on the side because I haven't done that side yet. Come and sit here. So he stops her and he says, no, actually, I want to talk to you. It turns out that he has been in his new job. They have given him an assignment to travel to the Rewa Valley and do a reportage piece on the movement that's going on over there. And he knows from having, because she's been working in his house for longer, that she actually is originally from that region. I mean, she's an Adivasi woman who came to the city some years ago. So he says, okay, this is great because I can begin to understand the background of the story first by talking to Relku. Her name is Relku. Again, Relku is, it's very interesting how Adivasi communities and they're so kind of, when you talk about sound, like people are, they're inventive. I mean, this is again something that I think we sort of urban people, when we say people are of this tradition, we kind of think that that's a very fixed and standard tradition and people only do things according to tradition. There's actually a lot of innovation and play, much more sometimes I've seen in Adivasi communities than we have in the way we treat our own tradition. We are a lot more stuck up about it. For example, this name I came across in the Narmada Valley. I met a young girl called Relku, and her father told me that we named her Relku because Adivasis used to go, and they still go on yearly migrations to do manual labor in cities because they have a very short growing season. They can't support themselves through the non-growing season, and they have to migrate for doing manual labor to big cities wherever there is manual labor projects or job or whatever going on, construction, road building. They are often doing the ones who do the hardest kind of manual labor work. Anyhow, so this young girl, the father told me that she was born while they were traveling on a train, on the rail, they call it the rail. They were traveling on the rail to a city and she was born at that time in the train. So they named her Relku because from the rail. So I really liked that name and I gave this character the name of Relku. Anyway, so Relku is sort of, so he starts talking to her and she starts describing her life and how things were and so on and so forth. And sorry, I might lose track of time.
No issues, no issues. But what is interesting when you are talking about Relku and where you had started, that so many thousands of people were just numbered in the newspaper and in the political and governmental documents. Yeah. And when you get into each one of them, they have a life story to really share or to be told to the people.
Yes.
And that comes out very clear, either with the boy or even people like Relku, you know.
Yeah. So Relku's story occupies the first half of the book. She describes her life before she migrated to the city, how she grew up, what they were like, what life was like. How she used to go with her brothers and neighborhood children to play, swing from the banyan trees or go hunting for birds. Her older brother was becoming proficient with the bow and arrow, so he was always carrying that, practicing it and trying to shoot. And then there are humorous kind of asides where he tries to shoot a bird, but doesn't get the bird, but the arrow gets stuck up there, so he has to go and bring it down. But as he climbs right up on the top part of the tree where the arrow is stuck, he notices, because he gets the height, he notices something coming from a distance. and you hear this the sound of an engine, and he's surprised. He's like, "What is that?" But he gets so kind of distracted by that sound and trying to figure out what it is, that he gets onto a very kind of broken and dried out branch of the tree, and it cracks and he comes crashing down. And anyway, so then we see what is the sound coming from. It's a forest department jeep, and there is a forest officer, and now we hear their conversation in the jeep and how they look down on these Adivasi people and how they think of them as very savage and uncivilized people. And essentially, they are coming here to meet the people and tell them that some road construction is going to start over here, and that it's time for them to sort of become part of the national mainstream and not just live, as he himself says, stop living like monkeys in the jungle. So this whole civilizational mission, I mean, at the same time, you have to understand that these characters, these government officials, or whoever, I mean, different people are different, and a lot of government officials were not bad people in themselves. They genuinely believed that it is our duty to bring civilization to these very backward people who are living off the land and living a kind of a sort of very hand-to-mouth existence. The fact is that people were poor by our normal urban standards, of course, but they had a very rich life, and they really did not feel the need or the want for something new or different or for change. It was just thrust upon them. I mean, essentially, the so-called development was brought and said, "You guys need this, and you must become part of it." And of course, in that process, they also get exploited by it. So anytime we talk about development, it's a double-edged sword. Anyway, so then there is a discussion between them and all this stuff, and through the discussion, what I'm trying to do, and that's I feel the power of graphic narrative is, they're having a discussion. So you're reading something, but what you're seeing is not related to what you're reading, as in not directly. I'm using that opportunity to give kind of glimpses of Adivasi way of life. I mean, the very thing in the text the guy is trying to say is all nonsense, and you need to leave it behind and progress in life. With the images, I'm kind of trying to oppose what the text is saying. I'm trying to show, in fact, how kind of close to nature and how diverse and how, through whether it's focusing on the young kids going to pick up mahua flowers or hunting birds, or people are not unhappy. They're not starving. They're not dying. I mean, people are living with nature and within that context. And within that context, they are not rich by any means, but they are certainly not poverty struck. They're not poor. So anyway, so visually, I try to sort of create a conflict between what the text is saying and what the image is saying.
The interesting part is that we managed to convince the indigenous people that they are not developed, and development is at the doorstep, and they need it to be in the mainstream. And I think that is where the development could reach them. But on the other hand, we did not really take an honest cognizance of whether that was a good way of living or not. Including religion, it was imposed on them, apart from development, I believe.
Yes, of course. Anyway, I mean, if I explain everything, then we'll never get through the book. So I'd like to, I'll focus, slow down and focus on certain bits. And if you want me, anybody wants to interrupt and say, like Mansali, like you are doing, everybody is welcome to do that. You can say, "Oh, wait, stop there. I want to see what is that," or "What have you drawn here?" If you have any questions, feel free to stop me and ask. Otherwise, I'll just keep moving on.
Sure. So I have put all Arijit's work in the chat box for you guys to look at. And also, I'm sure you will call for this book as well.
Yeah. So yeah, so what happens is that Relku describes her growing up and all that goes on, and I continue to use her words with images that expand the meaning of her words, because she is speaking from her own experience as a young girl growing up, what is going on. But I take with the images, I take a longer view. I mean, I show the longer, or rather the wider implication of what she's saying. So her words are bringing it across in a very personal sense, and the images are sort of making it more universal. So we see how the roads are being built, how the buses are coming, how the bridges are being built over where the people used to fish in the river. Then you see how the traders come on the buses. They come as settlers. They start building pakka houses, which the Adivasis never had. And so this whole process carries on. And that is all a lead up to that thinking, which then goes into making of dams. And, but this is the background to it. And then we see more of the same forest officer and the local, like a contractor, forest contractor. So there's a kind of a collusion between them. And the contractor brings his woes to the forest ranger, saying that the forest officer saying that, look, these tribal people, they're coming in the way of my access to, I mean, essentially taking away, cutting down trees, taking away forest produce. All of this begins over time. These things happen. And
what we learn from Rokul is that we all have these kind of people around us in everyday life, and each one of them have this extensive life.
Yes.
If it can be elaborated. In fact, many of us also belong to that kind of life. It's only that our stories are not getting written up beautifully like Rokul's story,
Yeah, it's true. Absolutely. Anyhow, so what happens ultimately is that, and this is another typical strategy that was used to take over Adivasi lands, especially the fertile parts of the Adivasi lands, is that like here is a kind of exchange between the well-established trader who sells alcohol. Now the young Adivasi men earlier, they would have their own mahua and other alcohol during festive points, but that's it. They did not have a culture of always imbibing alcohol. So these bottled and very strong alcohols compared to the natural mahua, these start getting introduced by the local traders. And slowly some of the young Adivasi men started to get addicted to it. They didn't have any way to kind of keep a check on that. They had no, they were too innocent perhaps to understand. And so this is an episode where Relku's father goes to try to plead with because what happens then is they get addicted, they start taking this, the trader starts to offer them this alcohol on credit. So then it becomes like, okay, you don't have to pay, you pay later, drink now, pay later kind of thing, and the credit mounts up. And then that becomes a way for the guy to take over the property or land of the family. After once it's very obvious that the person can't pay back, it's a huge amount, and then the land gets taken over. So this is exactly what happens. So I mean, I had heard about some of these episodes, and I kind of created this sort of a fictional part of it, talking about this thing.
There are some questions coming up for you in the chat box, so we will take them. And while you are explaining, narrating your story, you can take those questions. Okay. So your experience of print versus the digital medium now. Maybe Simar, you can unmute yourself and ask so that Arijit can integrate the answer for your question.
Okay, fine. Let's do it like that. I mean, should I? I'm not sure. Should I open the chat box and all that?
No, I will read it for you, or the participants can also interact with you, because that makes it better,
Yeah, sure.
You can help that. Simar, would you like to ask your question? And then Arijit can continue with his narration with your question as well.
Hi, Orijit. I'm a huge fan. I've been following your work for a really long time, and this book is so beautiful. And I was just thinking of how, we've seen different, like People Tree, when we'd go to CP and all, we'd see the t-shirts and the artworks and the prints, and everything was so easily accessible like that. And now we'd love to get a copy of the book like in print to really see the drawings in detail. And I had a question actually, particularly because some of my friends in Bangalore, I've now moved to Goa, so I will definitely come meet you. But we are a water collective. We are a bunch. There are some filmmakers, artists, and we worked on the story of water here in Bangalore city for a few years. So we did some mixed media arts festivals and everything. But by the end of it, it felt like it did not fully translate to action or even the responsibility, because we did a lot of events around where the artists were living and a lake close by, but they never really visited the lake or saw what happened later.
Right.
So my question was like, what do you think when it comes to action? Like, is it really the individual or is it the collective that drives action?
I would say it's both. I mean, if you just look at it as a broad principle, sometimes individual actions or even individuals with their actions can inspire and create a domino effect, which leads from one thing to another. Sometimes this domino effect takes place over time. I mean, it's not necessarily that's always visible straight away. And the other thing is that collective action is, of course, I mean, we cannot do without that. That's the most powerful thing. And again, if I was to say, most of my friends in Couplebridge were activists. I mean, in the sense, active, when I say activists, meaning people who take part in collective actions or who initiate collective actions. In that sense, people have often described me as an artist activist. I'm not too sure what that means. I mean, I engage, I take part, but for me, my form of expressing it is my art. I mean, I create art that comes out of that collective action and also kind of supports it or gives a voice or an expression to it of a certain kind. And I always look for mediums, whether it's t-shirts or it's comics or it's social media. I always look for medium where the appropriate medium which will make the greatest impact with that message or whatever it is, with the idea that we want to put out. So I would say, yeah, these two are important. But at the same time, if your question somehow relates also to the role of art in activism, I would say that it works in different ways in different times and places. I've noticed that in my own lifetime because I've been doing this for a long time. But it's really important and good to connect up with collective actions already instead of as an artist doing just your thing, is to see how can I become part of that action, but also be out of it, because as an artist, how do I express that into some form? I mean, how do I put, even if people are standing on a street and demonstrating, that is one form of expression. And I'm up there whenever there is a possibility, I'm there on the street with the people. However, when I go back, then I'm like, okay, how can I take this into a different medium or a different form, or how can I put this out in a different way? So, so they're all interrelated. But as I do know one thing, that as an artist, I don't set myself up to expect results from what I do directly, because I think art creates an impact which is much deeper and much longer. And it's not something that, yeah, of course we do campaigns, and sometimes campaigns are successful, sometimes they're not. They have a short shelf life. But even if I do like a social media post, which is about something really current and specific, just something that somebody said yesterday and is creating a buzz today, and I make a post about it, I still think of it as something that is going to, I think of it as a kind of like a long thing. It has an impact over a period of time. I do it for the ages. whatever I do, I may do it for a very specific thing right now, but I also have this sense that it is for the ages. It can make an impact many years later. It can create something, or it can help somebody click something in somebody's head, which I would never have expected. And I've seen that happen. And that's how I have a faith in that. I know that art can change things at a very fundamental level, and not necessarily in the ways that we expect it to. We can't just say we want to create art in order to do this. It may not happen. But something else may happen, which you never expected. Something much greater, perhaps. So, yeah. So, do you think, I mean, does that answer something of what you said?
Yes. Thank you so much. And I'll meet you in person and go deeper into this. It will be really nice if you could share some time. And thank you, Mansi, for organizing such amazing talks. I've been following Arijit's work for so long, and it was very nice to come and see your work up close. Thank you, Arijit, for sharing.
Thank you.
And I also feel like as a storyteller, I'm also drawing from this story is like the socio-cultural aspect and like the local references and the folk.
Yeah.
So that is very interesting. And I think us living in the cities, we don't get to see that up close. If we
right. Yeah.
That's what I learned today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that process of, like I said, researching in the sense going and immersing yourself in a space and amongst people whose story you want to tell, you can't do it from the outside. You have to totally go as deeply as you can into that and feel it with your heart before you start telling somebody's struggle or story or whatever. And of course, do a lot of sketching. I love to sketch. I mean, I take photographs, I make drawings, I make thousands of sketches. I write down stories. I mean, in fact, when I was doing River of Stories, for example, there was no digital photography. So it was expensive. I mean, I would get 36 frames in one roll of film, and I could only afford to carry a few rolls at a time. So I had to be very choosy about what I photographed. But drawings, I could just keep doing. And the thing with drawings was that it would always bring people around me, because they're always curious to either see a guy sitting and drawing or standing and drawing or doing whatever, they'll come to see. And it would always start off a conversation. And that's the best way, I mean, it would also aid in my observation of people and things, just because I was drawing. When you take a photograph, very often what happens is you capture that moment and then you've immediately lost interest in that, because now you're looking for the next photograph. While when you're drawing, you make yourself still in the middle of all this movement, and that's when observation becomes really heightened. So these forms of research, visual research, are very critical to finally telling stories later.
We have Bibhu's question. Would you like to take it while you are scrolling down?
Yeah, sure.
So Bibhu?
Yeah, no, like, I mean, this is in response to this this discussion that we could convince the tribal communities that, like, I mean, the other side is better, right? So getting educated and everything. I think that's something which is also same for non-tribal rural communities as well. Right? I think all of us had that aspiration. Yes.
I mean, that is true of any powerful versus powerless equation at any level, whether it's in the city or it's elsewhere or in rural areas. I mean, the powerful are always convincing the powerless that what their way is the right way.
Right. Yes.
And the reason for convincing them is to exploit them. Sadly, that cycle keeps on playing out.
Yes. Yeah. And that's also precisely the reason why a Coke company, for instance, like any cola company, hires these like an icons, right? So that's also one way of using the power.
Yeah, absolutely.
Out to the larger mass.
Yeah.
And that also comes out very clearly in your narrative, how from slowly convincing people, how the development narrative becomes overpowering to the people. All the people do resist in the case of Narmada and in your narrative as well.
Yeah.
Because you do close your story with a positive end, because the boy changes.
Yes. The boy changes his heart, and Malgu Gayan finally ends his song, because his song keeps appearing through the story. I mean, as I said, I mean, it's sort of, I've structured it like multiple stories. There's Relku story, there's Malgu Gayan story, there's Vishnu story, and they're kind of weaving between each other, moving back and forth. And in the end, yes, Vishnu changes his heart, but Malgu Gayan has a very powerful question to ask of all the non-Adivasi, the people who on the other side. And I end with that question, which is a pretty existential kind of a question. So, so because at that time when I was working on it, the Narmada Andolan was in full power and people were. So, of course, everybody wanted to ask me, in your story, are we going to win or are we going to lose? So in the end, so that was a question that kept going on in my mind, like, yeah, it's true. What am I going to show? I felt if I made it like they win in the end, that would be hopeful for everyone and nice for everyone, but perhaps not. It would be a bit of sugarcoating of the truth, because although they were fighting with the best of their abilities, I could also see that it perhaps is a bit of a losing battle, which ultimately that's what happened. I mean, the dam was built ultimately.
Yeah.
So, so I didn't want to kind of just do such a simplistic positive end. Neither, of course, I did not want to do a negative end. And so it's, I've left it hanging with this existential question so that it obviates, I mean, it sort of sidetracks this basic question of, okay, who won? So it's not about who won, because who won or did not win is not relevant to the larger question, because as far as the larger struggle is concerned, nobody has yet won or nobody has yet lost, and we are all still fighting. So
we are in a lost stage actually in the development discourse, we must say. But I just want to...
I would still say that we are not lost. Because if we had lost, then we wouldn't be bothered to be meeting here and talking, because we would say, what's the point?
So there is a optimism still there.
Yeah, there is a fight on. I mean, it may be very much subdued, but it's on in many people's hearts, in their actions, in all of that. And I think as long as we are alive and we are talking and fighting and doing everything, drawing and creating art and music, whatever, I think the fight is alive.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to add here, because I just missed mentioning to you that actually last month on 24th of October, we did get Medhaji to talk about Jal Satyagraha. So she took us through the historical journey, and it was superb, you know. So and then when we are having your session, it comes out very live in a very different format, you know. Yeah, we have to come. So the Simar, we do have to come for interlinking of rivers in one of the Wednesdays, but we will focus here on how the boy changes, and eventually he actually questions what's going on there. So Arijit, over to you, back to you.
Okay. So anyway, so then this episode happens where the uncle, so Relku's uncle, that is father's younger brother, who would become an alcohol addict, gets beaten up and brought home and thrown down, and said that this guy can't pay his debts. So it's more like a violent threat by some gundas on a rainy night. And so next day, father goes to the police station to say that I want to lodge a complaint because these people came and they severely beat up my brother. And so the police officer, of course, the police constable takes the side of they know, everybody knows what's going on. And he obviously lectures him and says, you people, you're trying to make complaint against like a highly respected member of the community, which is the alcohol dealer. And don't you dare try that. But he anyway, he insists that he's going to make a FIR or complaint. And not an FIR, they write down like an official complaint. So he insists on that and goes off. Then, of course, he pays the price for it. At night, the cops come to his house and they take him away. And then he's severely beaten.
Beaten, yes. This is so true in everyday life, and urbanites, we don't come to know that these things are happening.
Yeah.
whether it is Bakswaha or interlinking or Narmada or.
Yes. And then the Rathore, the alcohol dealer, who's basically a big merchant of that area now. He funds a lot of things around there. So we see afterwards that after he's been beaten up, I wanted to suggest that they actually kill him, but I didn't want to make it like a blood and gore kind of a thing. But I left it to the reader's imagination to think what happened to me. Anyway, so they shake hands, the police officer and this guy, and that ends that story. And meanwhile, Rilku and a brother and somebody else have gone to another village for some festival, and they're returning home late at night on their bullock cart.
So I guess every migrated person has some story or the other like this. It may not be through dam or some development, but something.
But of course,
it brings them to the city, you know.
Yes, I mean they are basically displaced people by whatever means they're displaced.
Yeah.
And it's also parallels the way, let's say, it's not only humans. I mean, we are displacing elephants from their forests. We are displacing. Those are also finally the victims of this whole process of displacement. And they are losing their habitats, their lives, their communities, their families. I mean, after all, like elephant herds are like families. And when they lose their young ones to a train accident or something. So it's much, I would say that it's like we just talked about, the rule of the powerful over the powerless, and how the powerful will continue to encroach upon the spaces of the powerless and drive them out. Anyway, so they finally burn their house, basically to drive them off the land, because even though they beat up her father and everything, the family is sort of trying to stubbornly stay on. But they have already been told that you no longer own this land because you owe this much money, and so you should get out. But they don't. They try not to get out. Then they burn their house. So it is Rilku discovers in sheer shock one evening. She comes home late, and the first thing she says is their house up in flames.
So I will just pose my little question here because there are these expressions which are made through graphics and text. But then every little box also actually opens up our imagination to a lot of other things, which you were also saying that I leave it to your imagination. But I realized even from our childhood, when we were reading these kind of books, or even when children are looking at comics nowadays, when we see that what is shown is one part of it, but then it also opens up our imagination to a lot of other things. So just like here, you have two boxes which are showing as one part the horror story based on the burning of the house. So what I'm trying to say is that what is expressed here is actually multifold in our imagination.
Absolutely.
So you have already compressed multiple imaginations into a small little box to express something, but then it again opens up, you know, when the reader is reading.
Yeah, that's put very well. That's exactly how the medium works. What it provokes in the reader's or the viewer's mind is much greater than what is actually being depicted on the page. Yes. The page is, all these frames are like triggers. They're just triggers to trigger many other things in your mind, you know. And that's why I like comics so much, because it's a medium which the reader has a lot of control over. It's like when you see, for example, you see a movie, the director has full control about how long you will see something, and then it will change to this, and you are, as a audience, are a passive. I mean, you are completely at the filmmaker's mercy to in what way you will see that work. And every moment in time will obliterate the previous one because it's all takes place on the same screen. But in comics, every moment is time is laid out in space. You can go back and forth. You can make connections as you like. You can read a part and then say, oh, but I saw that thing 3 pages ago, which had something bearing with this. So then you can flip back and look at that. So it gives and then you can imagine, like you see 2 frames. You don't see everything. You just see 2 frames and there's a lot of empty space in between. What happened there? You imagine that. So it's a very active sort of a medium to engage with. And that's really why, to me, that's it makes it one of the most powerful forms, which is
personally because I am engaged in writing only text, I find that it also gives opportunity for readers to imagine certain things, but then it is still bounded, you know, it is not guiding the reader what to imagine. Whereas when you have this kind of a combination of text and graphics, it at least guides the reader in which direction to imagine.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Relku's story finally comes to an end when she says that, so we had no choice but to pack up our things, whatever little things we had, and leave as migrants to the city. And so there is this final image of them walking down a slope towards the city. And then they're on a train and heading for the city, leaving their village behind for good. So that ends the first part, and the second part is called The River, which takes the story into the city, what happens in the city. But I think I should stop here because it's been quite long, and I'm sure everyone would have a certain bandwidth to, you know, go into that. But I think because of this first part, it kind of covers various different things. It covers Adivasi creation myth, it covers Relku's story, it introduces Vishnu and his urban kind of a context. So these are the main threads that run through the whole book. The first part kind of introduces all of them, and then they play out in different ways in the rest of the book. So I'm glad that I was able to take you through this entire first part in detail.
Thank you so much, Arijit, because reading it by myself was definitely a pleasure, but hearing it from you after reading it is definitely worth it. And I encourage everybody to read, because I think comics is something which we all have enjoyed in our childhood, and I know many people still enjoy it in their adulthood as well. Although many people may say use it as, like, you know, as a de-stressing factor, but some people also see it as a medium to express, and there are not many like you who are using it as medium. But for us, we are privileged to have people like you who can make these kind of art forms and help us express our you know, either grievances, you can say, or the goodnesses of the society. Because there are so many things we want to express, but then we all have our own strength and weakness in expressing what we want to. Exactly. But this definitely comes out as one of the strongest mediums to express, because it catches not only the imagination, but it also goes deep into our cognitions, I will say. You know, it stays in our heart, it stays in our mind, even if the story is over, it's really not over. At least from in the mind space, and it's going to stay for long. I mean, for that matter, all of us who are sitting here today can relate with many of the stories we have read in our childhood, and even who are reading today. So I think with this, I would definitely like to thank you again for you know, taking your time out, and also doing the book reading for us. But let me just see if there are some quick questions from the participants, and I know some very good people are still around, and some of us have also been our speakers in Wednesdays for Water. Right. So let us see if you want to interact or have any questions or suggestions or anything. If you want to open your mic and then speak up for the session. Anyone would like to speak? So we, as a usual procedure, we would like to open the floor for the participants. Usually participants are often taking some time because they are not sure when are we opening the floor for people. So we still give some time. And I'll just leave one question with you so that you may answer till people are finding time. Because we clearly see with these kind of art forms which are very strong to really convey what's going on in the society. And I will take a point from Simar where she talked about its impact. But I because following your work and being in contact with you for some time, I really want to ask you, if we are all going into this development discourse where we all know, educated or the so-called, we call them indigenous or uneducated, not developed people. And the development inherently is a displacement of something, or in fact, humanity. We are seeing socially, we are also getting displaced. And in this kind of governing scenarios, it is getting all the more difficult, not only for scientists, but also for artists to really come up and raise their, at least put their voice, if not raise against it, but to put their voice in different mediums. How do you think that people as of today are really receiving these kind of art forms as a tool? Right from music to all kinds of art forms, they have been since antiquity the main mobilizer of social movements.
Well,
what do you see today as in India?
I think that it would be fair to say that as powerful as the the ruling forces, the governments, the authorities, they are getting more and more powerful as technology becomes more sophisticated, and all that technology is at the service of the governments and other authorities and so on. Just as they get more and more powerful, like I think in my own time I've seen like all this kind of initiatives, whether it's from making Aadhaar cards or getting people to have digital bank accounts, it's all ways of control. I mean, today with digital technology, the power and the control that the government has over individuals has gone up manifold, and they are really trying to control people in a much closer and deeper way than before. But just as the government's powers and the authorities and other sort of figures of power, the capitalists, just as their power has gone up, I think the power of artists and musicians and campaigners, activists have also gone up, because they have taken whole activism and campaigning to a different level through all these media, including so there are people who are campaigning against surveillance. I mean, they are using sophisticated tools and technologies to counter government's surveillance efforts or create awareness about surveillance. I mean, young people today, only because of the spread of the internet and the same technologies, they are, like I was saying about earlier, young people today are much more aware. They have access. They are not, I mean, sadly, there are some people who may have all this information, but they still doesn't affect their heads. I mean, they don't change their minds. But a lot of young people, because I interact with a lot with young people, I show my work to people. I teach at a couple of universities, and I have a lot of interaction with young people on social media as well. And I feel that it may not be a vast number, but there is a strong force of resistance, and people are fighting it. Just as the governments are getting, or the oppressors are getting more powerful, the resistance is also growing more powerful. So that's what my sense is, that this is also like, that's why I say that the fight is on. I don't think the fight is coming to an end.
Irony of this struggle or fight, as we may say, putting the agonies of the society in a beautiful way in this art form, is that we are all representing one humanity. It's just that the ideology and viewpoints are different, and the tools are different to express what is good for the society and what is not good for the society.
Yeah.
So those who are thinking that everybody has to have X kind of development, probably is also an ideology and good in their mind space, as some people who think that one has to go from human lives and other things, which is very well articulated in your work. And that's why I bring that point here. So I think this kind of readings are very important, especially for youngsters and for people like us, to remind ourselves that every life matters. It's not only this life matters or that life matters. Exactly. And I think that's a good point also to bring an end to this conversation. And we would like to thank all the participants who have been present here and listening to us. And also there are some participants who have been joining Wednesdays for Water for last 6 months regularly as our guests. So I'd like to thank them, and I want to inform all of you that we have our sessions lined up until January, and we are already filling up sessions for February. If you have any ideas, if you want to take up a session, please let us know. And our next session is a hard session, and we are talking about water sensitive planning, and we have professor from CEPT University planning. And then we have a very eminent speaker from Center for Science and Environment from Delhi, Suresh Rohilla ji. So he needs no introduction, to be honest. So as you can see, we are really lined up with sessions. 1st of December, we are talking about water in higher education. So we will really have head of the institutions, couple of them coming us and talking to us how water education can influence the way society looks at water and manages its water. So this is Wednesdays for Water for you once again. And now I would like to thank Arijit Sen again, Arijit Da, as I call him, being a Bengali, talking to another Bengali. So really, really thankful to you for doing the book reading. I can completely understand that we cannot complete the entire book as you would like to read it through, but I'm hoping that we get some opportunity to do it physically with you at one of the schools which are our host and partners in Wednesdays for Water, and we would love to have you there because our representatives are here. So on behalf of the entire team, I thank you again for joining us and really look forward to learning from you again and look forward to having more of your sketches and words and viewpoints to inspire the generations to come. Thank you so much, Arijit. Vibhu, do you have something to add here?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Arijit and everyone here. It was a wonderful session.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to all of you and showing my work. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everyone who spoke, Simar, for your comments. It was really lovely evening for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, speakers, for the enlightening session. And thank you, participants, for joining and making the session interactive. Let me quickly take you through the individuals who make this collective. Vibhu Prasad Nayak, Fauzia Tarannum, Ganesh Shankar, Rajiv Shah, Gautami Baviskar, Manisha Sharma, Megha Gupta, Srinivas MR, Vasanta Subaya, and myself, Mansi Bal Bhargav. We represent Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad, Terry School of Advanced Studies, New Delhi, Environmental Design Consultants, Ahmedabad, FluxGen Sustainable Technologies, Bangalore, Counterview, and we are supported by Wikis Water Resources Council. We appreciate your support and encouragement in conducting the series, and we hope that you will stay connected with us and continue joining us. Thank you once again to all of you. We look forward to having you in the next session. Please take care of yourself. Bye-bye.